The title of the paper is Reading Stones, Writing Skins, the Savage Naga and the Limits of Language. It's more a set of kind of collection of some ramblings than a full-fledged paper. But I think some of those ramblings will resonate with what Mike just so wonderfully set out. As historians, we are taught to be tempted to read everything. We read meanings, we read social structures, we read syntaxes of power, grammars of cultures, and lexica of objects. The allegorical extension of the term reading has reached a metaphorical height from which it has become almost impossible to recognize the arbitrariness of the ways in which the world is revealed to the historian as a text. It is a banal statement, I know, but I again became acutely aware of this as I began to sift the private and official papers of a bunch of colonial administrators who spearheaded a sort of bureaucratic revolution in the northeastern frontier in British India in the 1910s and 20s. Charged with the task of keeping peace in this cartographically largely undefined frontier between the mountainous landmasses we today separate as India, Burma, and China, which was abhorred as the grazing ground of multiple headhunting, nomadic, slave-raiding, and opium-eating communities, so abhorred that for most part of the British rule in South Asia, these communities, these tribes were considered too primitive to be brought within the jurisdictional boundary of the empire. Charged with keeping peace in this kind of a terrain, these officials began to develop a style of governance in which understanding and codifying the internal logic of the savage mind was central. I deliberately invoke the title of Levi-Strauss as he made much use of the data and interpretations generated by these administrator anthropologists in both the savage mind and the elementary structures of kinship. It was no coincidence that the three major architects of this bureaucratic school, Thomas Callan Hodgson, John Henry Hutton, and James Philip Mills, all ended up in the major anthropology positions in British universities. Hodgson was recruited as Alfred Haddon's successor in readership in ethnology at the University of Cambridge in 1926 over the claims of Malinowski, and eventually became the first William Wise Professor of Social Anthropology in 1932. Hutton, who was the most influential of the three, both as an administrator and as an academic, succeeded Hodgson as the second William Wise Professor at Cambridge by the early 1940s, and in 1947, after holding the fort in the region since the departure of Hutton until the end of British rule, Mills became the first reader in anthropology in SOAS, one of the first SOAS. They also trained a significant number of frontier officials, including William Archer, one of the first theorists of primitivism in art, and Verrier Elwin, Nehru's principal advisor in Northeastern policies after the transfer of power, collaborated with major museologists, anthropologists, and psychoanalysts of their time, such as Henry Balfour, James Fraser, Christoph Heimendorf, and C.J. Seligman. I mention these quick facts in order to underscore a largely overlooked traffic between these frontier experiences, which remain minorized and exceptionalized in the mainstream South Asian history, and the slow metropolitan unfolding of a loosely structuralist mode of thinking. Reading was a central technology to this dovetailing of administration and academia. As administrators, the Huttonians, let me use that as a shorthand for this school, preached against the use of indiscriminate violence against the offending customs of the primitive Nagas, which had been the standard imperial practice for most of the 19th century. The tribes needed to be understood, they argued, in terms of a logic which was inherent in their practices but opaque and illegible to the Nagas themselves. The job of a good frontier officer was to be able to recover, decipher, and read this language. This is the most consistent, explicit trope in Hutton. This almost grammatical structure in which the savages were unknowingly caught in order to work through and not against their native customs. Therefore, in 1920, when Hutton, the Deputy Commissioner of the Naga Hills, was made the Honorary Director of the Department of Ethnology, he began to publish, together with his colleagues, a whole series of rigorously detailed academic monographs on material cultures and epistemological assumptions of several groups he understood as distinct Naga tribes. These fat, meticulous volumes, along with scores of articles the officers published in various reputed and internationally circulating academic journals, constituted a body of literature that continues to function as the archival motor of both Indian policymaking and Naga nationalism until today. In trying to read the words of the Naga, these works have taught us to expect a relationship of legibility in the histories of and in which the Huttonians were writing. The paradox is simple, or so it seems. The Naga writes his culture without being able to read it, which is where the administrators and the academics come in. And yet, without the Huttonian readings, there is no unity of a culture to be accessed. Establishing this relationship of legibility with the material worlds of the Naga was thus a fundamental methodological challenge to the Huttonians in their dual capacities as governors and scholars. Elsewhere, I have written about the immense labor of these bureaucrats in making headhunting, a primary administrative concern in this frontier, a legible practice, instead of a bestial sign of the mute, meaningless passion of the irrational savage. Hodgson and Hutton claim to interpret it as an irreducibly human activity that was intentionally invested, semantically accessible, and linguistically communicable. This, in turn, allowed them to enforce in practice a rule of substitutes for human heads, usually monkey heads, without what they thought distorting, I quote, the essential language of primitive symbolism, close quotes. Writing under the shadow of the interpretation of dreams, the Huttonians similarly tried to read the dreams of the Nagas, read their residential patterns, their styles of braiding hair, their dresses, their log drums, and so on and so forth. In order to make the Naga a criminalizable subject in modern law, first of all, he had to be made an intending agent of his culture that he himself was barred from reading. At this juncture, I wish to point at the instance of a specific archival enemy in the early 20th century Naga Hills, not so much with the expectation of finding a conclusive answer to this conundrum, as with the hope of redrawing and rethinking the lines of doubt that carve out our aphoretic mind today. What I want to briefly share with you is a certain history of this reductive explanatory limit as articulated, experienced, and struggled with by the Huttonians that, I would argue, we have still not managed to displace, surmount, or step over. Central to this history are a set of stones, quite a range actually, from small celts of 6 inches to huge 50-foot high menhirs and dolmens, and a stack of skins, photographed, copied, sketched by numerous Europeans, ostensibly for the designs or tattoos inscribed on them. From the published and unpublished papers of Hutton and his colleagues, it becomes clear that for more than 50 years, he has been particularly grappling with the meanings of stones amongst a people he often described as Stone Age. The megaliths in the frontier, raised by some of these communities, attracted imperial attention right from the early 19th century and were interpreted variously as sites of druid magic, witnesses of oaths, mausoleums, monuments of sun worship, fertility symbols, boundaries, places of origin of clans, reflecting the variety of interpretations teased out of different Nagas at different points of time and place by different interlocutors. In his 1922 paper, The Meaning and Method of the Erection of Monoliths by the Naga Tribes, Hutton, who was reading Freud voraciously at this time and was in constant touch with the popularizers of Freud in England and Europe, argued characteristically, I quote, that the Naga himself has forgotten what the stones actually represent, close quote. And instead of trying another set of elders, insisted on being present in several stone pooling ceremonies and constructing a logical reading of these practices. His term. In the paper, he argued that these were phallic symbols and represented the male and female principles, which he said defined the entire use of stone in that society, even if in many villages only single stones were erected. But I'm not so much concerned here with the veracity or absurdity of his particular interpretation, which he would modify and sophisticate over the next 4 decades in several other publications, as with a larger question that he raised briefly for the first time in this paper and then kept coming back to it intermittently over the rest of his career, and that is the question concerning materiality and language. Hutton spoke repeatedly of translation in matters of stone. Stones are translations, he argues. Translation into permanency, his exact phrase, through which we get a sense of the original wavering language which has been lost. But the Naga knows it, even when he does not. He knows it so well, so immediately, in such an embodied fashion, that he can tell the gender of a stone by simply looking at it. And here, I want to read out a string of excerpts from Hutton's personal unpublished notes. On 3rd March 1923, he writes in his diary, Zeluma, one of his interpreters, bought 4 little celts, one a perfect triangle, the others irregular. The triangle and another one, according to him, are male, which I find hard to believe. He cannot give any explanation. Close quote. 4 days later, he seems to have cross-checked Zeluma's interpretation in another village with a dream-interpreting wise woman, and I quote, the woman identifies the same Celts as male, also does not know why. Another excerpt from November 1925 mentions discussing with a fairly intelligent Naga, who among many other things knew how to read stones, quotations. But it is, and then he makes this comment, but it is ambitious of me to expect even this fairly intelligent man to explain satisfactorily the rules of interpretation. He tried the criteria of shape, color, surface texture, location, origin, although, admittedly, desisted from licking the Celt. In his 1924 paper, 2 Celts from the Naga Hills, Hutton complained that the owner refuses to part with it, as he finds licking it an infallible cure for a hot tongue, with which he is no doubt very frequently troubled as a result of his alcoholism. But none of these portable, disembodied standards fitted perfectly. Well until the 1930s, sporadic comments occur in Hutton's private papers reflecting his frustration with this riddle, his term. This, of course, did not deter him from writing, as I mentioned earlier, several papers on what he eventually came to call the stone cult, engaging in long and spiteful debates with anthropologists from Melanesia, and delivering the Thurn Memorial Lecture to the Scottish Anthropological Society on a comparative study of stone use in West Africa, Indonesia, and Naga Hills. If the obstinacy of stones to be reduced to a relationship of legibility posed an unsolved challenge to Hutton, stoking his further interest in the subject, the question of tattoos was again another black hole in the Huttonian archive that raised serious doubts about the adequacy of the scholarly understanding of writing. For almost all European interpreters, tattooing was the closest the savage Naga came to writing. The pidgin Assamese word, ak, in fact did not distinguish between writing and tattooing. Missionaries read the sign of Christ in many of the designs, which for them was the chronicle of an evangelization foretold. Samuel Peel, a professional planter and an amateur anthropologist in the 1910s, proposed that these were the original designs from which the Naga textile decorations were derived. Administrators before the ascendancy of the Hattonian school read them as unmistakable signs of barbaric cruelty. The Hattonians took stabilized patterns of tattooing as heuristic devices for identifying particular tribes, clans, septs, and factories, and at least on two major occasions based important administrative decisions about customary rights of quarreling villages on the evidence of inscribed marks on skins. But an unsettling indecision ran through the entire archive of the Naga tattooing. And very simply put, what was the question of what constituted the primary units of the system. Particular graphic marks, 15 major types were established, or the body parts where these marks were inscribed, chin or forehead or chest or arm or calf or back. What was savage writing? The effect or the sight? I am not sure, I quote, I'm not sure anymore if we can continue to liken this tattooing practice with writing, wrote Mills at the end of his decades-long work on the Naga tattoos. The Nagas recognize each other by these arcs. It is true. However, shown to them on a clear piece of paper as carefully copied designs without unnecessary shading or mistakes, these signs fail to convey anything. If writing cannot detach itself from the materiality of its own surface, what good is it? Is it writing at all? This dilemma and embarrassment reverberates in my head today when I read a post-humanist thinker like Michel Serres, who, anticipating Latour, asks, what language do the things of the world speak, that we might come to an understanding with them contractually? I cannot stop wondering if we are forever condemned to the contractual expectation of the linguistic philosophy, if at all and how we may deal with what I can call the irrectifiable. We know that something is wrong, but we cannot know what to correct it against. No other model than that of reading and writing is available to us, the readers and heirs of these governor scholars, to make sense of the material worlds. In the middle of this terrifying paucity and uncomfortable patrilineal, I remember another short tradition recorded by Hutton. Deity gave the knowledge of reading and writing both to the Nagas in the hills and plainsmen, but whereas the latter were given stone or paper on which to record their writings, the Nagas were given a book of skins, which came by an early end owing to its edible qualities. Must scholars stop licking the stones?
VoiceRepublic.com, home to the spoken word.